I'm really pleased to welcome everyone back to our first Bootham talk of the academic year, and really excited to introduce you to Michael Ruse, who is an old scholar from Bootham, but most importantly for us this evening, a philosopher. And Michael has a very long career in philosophy. He started off studying philosophy at Bristol University as an undergraduate, but then moved to Canada to do his master's and stayed in Canada then at the University of Guelph until 2000 as lecturer and then later professor. And then in the year 2000, he moved to Florida State University, where he was professor, and he was also the director of the program in history and philosophy of science. He is widely published. I couldn't possibly begin to read out his list of publications. It would take the whole hour up. And he has many honorary degrees. He is a leading thinker in the philosophy of science, and was the founding editor of the journal Biology and Philosophy, and also editor of the Cambridge series Philosophy and Biology. So I'm really excited to introduce him. He's going to talk to us about Can a Darwinian be a Christian, and really introduce us to the debate about the relationship between religion and science.
Okay. Oh, am I live now? Good. Well, I'll assume I am. Well, hello, everybody. I must say, I feel a little bit like the poacher turned gamekeeper, because quite frankly, when I was at Bootham, the idea that I'd be giving a talk like this not only would not have crossed my mind, it would certainly not have crossed Thomas Green's mind, the headmaster. In fact, it would be much less likely to cross his mind than cross mine. Anyhow, here I am, and hello, everybody. It's nice to be here. As you imagine, it's only 2 o'clock for me because I'm in Florida, and I'd like to say that the weather's about 70 degrees at the moment, Fahrenheit, and so it's really very pleasant indeed. I'm hoping that you're having lots of rain and misery, because it's no fun enjoying yourself if everybody else is enjoying themselves too. So anyhow, I'm going to talk about can a Darwinian be a Christian? I should say that I've worked on this problem probably for pretty much 50 years. And in a way, I think it is fair to say that this is reflective of my Quaker background, because Quakers, I like to think, spend a lot of time thinking about these things, arguing about these things. We don't have dogmas. You have to make up your own mind. And so certainly for me, this has been something of great intellectual, personal interest for a long time. So I'm going to share a few thoughts with you. Okay, so let's get going. Next, please. Okay, so the question is, can a Darwinian be a Christian? On the right-hand side, we've got Charles Darwin. I kind of recognize the guy on the left. I'm not quite sure, but obviously they're arm wrestling. And quite frankly, Jesus looks a lot fitter than Charles Darwin. So I think at least in this slide, he's going to win. Whether he win all the way through this talk is another matter. What I'm going to do first, though, is I'm going to introduce you to Charles Darwin just a little bit. This is just background. It's not intended to be, I'm not trying to slip something across you now so that, it's not an Agatha Christie thriller. So at the end, you'll say, oh, my goodness, I should have seen that slide. He slid something in. No, I'm not doing that. Okay, this is Charles Darwin. He was born in 1809. In fact, he was born, believe it or not, on the same day as Abraham Lincoln in America. And he died in 1882. So Victoria came to the throne in 1837. So it's all of his adult life. He was a Victorian, and he's very Victorian. Now, if you look at this picture, in fact, it's a very good portrait. It was done when Darwin was about 30, and it's a watercolor. And it's done by the best watercolor painter in England. It's a wedding portrait. We're just before photography comes on the scene. A couple of years later, and it would have been a photograph. The thing I want to point out is that Darwin came from a segment of society that could afford to have the best portraitist in England paint his portrait as a wedding portrait. And this simply tells you Darwin came from a very comfortable upper middle class family. His grandfather on his mother's side was Josiah Wedgwood, you know, the blue and white pottery. And as in fact, Darwin married a first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. So the thing I want to make is that they were very rich. Darwin never had to have a job. He never had to, he was able to be an independent gentleman. And I mean, they were really rich. I mean, they were Silicon Valley rich. And the reason why I want to mention this is that although I think Darwin's a great revolutionary, he's not a rebel. In other words, Darwin wasn't sitting in an attic, cold and miserable in some place that nobody's ever visited, like Scotland. No, he was very comfortable. So his ideas are revolutionary, but they're not new, if you know. In other words, I think the best metaphor for Darwin is a kaleidoscope. He took the pieces, he switched them around and made a completely new picture. But it were pieces that he was given rather than pieces he invented. Next, please. Now, this gives you just a quick sketch. He was born in 1809. In fact, he went to Cambridge University intending to be a clergyman, because being a clergyman was a good upper middle class job which didn't require a great deal of effort. You could hire a curate to do the heavy duty for you. But as it happens, he got interested in natural history and so got sidelined and spent some 5 years going around the world, particularly South America, on board HMS Beagle. He came back. He wasn't an evolutionist when he came back in 1836, but within 6 months, he became an evolutionist. I'll talk about that in a moment. He then discovered his theory, his mechanism or his cause, natural selection. For various reasons, he sat on his ideas for 20 years, I think mainly because he knew that if he was publishing, he wouldn't be very popular. And he didn't finally publish until 1859, when he published The Origin of Species. Then some 12 years later, he published a book on Our Species, The Descent of Man. And finally, he died in 1882. And that'll be my final slide. The question is, when he died, where did he go? Because I think this is an interesting reflection to the end of my talk. Next, please. So this is a contemporary portrait. I mean, this is not from back then. This is 20 years old or something like that. This is actually a watercolor of HMS Beagle. And you can see it. It's off the coast of South Africa. South America, I mean. The question is, why on earth would the British send a warship down to go round the coast for 4 years and then back across the Pacific and back to England, going around the globe? Why would they do that? Well, because this is we're now after the wars with Napoleon, the Napoleonic Wars. England is back in industrial revolution. They're just about to start railways. They've got a lot of goods that they've manufactured in places like Manchester and Birmingham, and they want to sell them. And where can they sell them? Well, one of the richest parts of the world in those days was South America. And so the British cargo ships were going out there laden, but there weren't very good maps around the coast. And you didn't want a merchant ship, running into a rock that nobody knew was there. And so HMS Beagle was surveying all around South America. Darwin was the sort of ship's naturalist. He wasn't a very good sailor, so what he would do is the ship would put in at port, Buenos Aires or somewhere like that. Darwin would get off and spend 2 months crisscrossing South America. He could afford to do this. He could afford to hire horses and servants and those sorts of things, while the ship was doing detailed mapping. Then Darwin would join them back again, and they go off further down the coast or round the bottom and up the other side. And so, as I say, they spent some 5 years altogether. Darwin spent 4 years going around South America, but a lot of the time he was off doing geology and that sort of thing. And then, as I say, they came home via the Pacific, next please, and across the Pacific, and then they ended up South Africa. They went back to America for a while, and then they went back to England, and they arrived back there, I think it was September 1836. Now, there's a group of islands called the Galapagos archipelago. It's off the coast. It's in the Pacific. It belongs to Ecuador now. It's off the coast of Ecuador. I mean, it's quite a way off the coast. And Darwin went there, and it was pointed out to him. He didn't discover this himself. It was pointed out to him that that the birds, and particularly the reptiles and amphibians, and these are tortoises, on the different islands are similar but different. And you can see here are 3 species of tortoise, which are obviously all tortoises. They obviously look as though they're related, but they're different. And yet they're on islands. I mean, I've been to the Galapagos, and I tell you, you can stand on one of the islands and see another one. So, as it were, the question was, why on earth would God so love the Galapagos that he'd make separate species for each island? And also that there would be another species of tortoise back on the mainland. But the interesting thing is they were on the mainland of South America, not the mainland of South Africa. Well, of course, Darwin got back, and next please, and he said there's only one explanation for this: evolution. And this is the first tree of life that Darwin grew. Interesting point I'll make as we go along. Notice most people think, and I'm going to show you somebody, say, oh yes, evolution's true because of the fossils, or it's false because of the fossils. It wasn't the fossils that made Darwin an evolutionist. It was geographical distribution. Very interesting point, I think, but there's no question about that. Now, Darwin was at Cambridge. The most important scientist who'd ever been at Cambridge was Isaac Newton, 200 years before, the great physicist. And basically, Newton was the ideal man at Cambridge. Darwin didn't do a science degree because there weren't science degrees. He was doing theology and that sort of thing, and classics. But he was mixing with some of the scientists then, and it was Newton. And Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, just at the end of the 18th century, had looked at biology, and he'd been rather sniffy about biology. And he ended up by saying, there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. In other words, biology will never get up to the standard of the physical sciences. And basically, Darwin thought, I'm going to show Immanuel Kant, I'm going to be the Newton of biology. Darwin was a very nice guy, very friendly, but he was very ambitious. And one of his best biographers said there was a sliver of ice in the heart of Charles Darwin. And I think that's absolutely true. So Darwin knew that if he was going to sort of score, there weren't Nobel Prizes in those days, but if he was going to win the Nobel Prize, he had to find the cause of evolution. What made it work? And it took 18 months for him to discover, and he finally discovered it at the end of September 1838. And by the way, the reason why I can tell you these dates so accurately is that Darwin kept notebooks. This is one of the notebooks that Darwin kept. So we can basically, work out what he's thinking almost, certainly week to week, almost day to day through these absolutely crucial times. Now, Darwin came from rural England. His family grew up in Shropshire. And England has had an industrial revolution at the end of the 18th century, which meant a lot of people left the land and went to the cities, where, of course, there was a population explosion, which meant there were fewer people on the land feeding more people in the cities. So in other words, an industrial revolution means you've got to have an agricultural revolution. Well, how do you have an agricultural revolution? Well, things like better fertilizers. But they realized that the secret, next please, was selection. You select, if you want fatter pigs, you breed from the fat pigs and kill off the thin ones before they breed. If you want beefier cattle, you breed from the fat cow or the beefy cattle and kill off the others. If you want shaggier sheep, you breed from the sheep with good fleeces and eat the lambs which don't have good fleeces early. And so this is obviously a pig. And Darwin knew then that the secret to change was selection. The question was, how could he get a natural form of selection? Well, as I say, at the end of September 1838, next please, Darwin twigged onto it. There'd been this population explosion. At the end of the 18th century, an English clergyman by the name of Thomas Robert Malthus had been looking at this population explosion, and he'd been saying, what's going to happen? Why are we just going to have people standing, side by side, just packed into the British Isles, as it were, and no room to move? No, he said, obviously not. There's not enough food and space to feed everybody. That means some won't get it. Some will not get it, others will. Some will. So he said there's going to be a struggle for existence, or in particular, struggle for reproduction. Interestingly, and this is part of what I mean by Darwin being a a revolutionary, not a rebel. Darwin got this idea. In fact, Malthus was not thinking about evolution. He was thinking, how is it that God gets us to work? Why aren't we all like philosophy graduate students? Get up at lunchtime, go to a couple of classes, go off to the, the pub or to the, to whatever it is, then supper, and then, okay, let's go out to the pub again and carouse until about 3 a.m, at which time we go to bed and we're all set to get up again at noon. Why don't we all spend our lives doing this? Well, because if we all did this, we'd all starve. We've got to work for a living. It's a struggle for existence. And so, as I say, Malthus is using this as what we call a natural theological explanation as to how God got us to work. Darwin saw this and said, aha, this is the, as it were, the power I need behind a natural form of selection. Only some are going to get through. And that he knew that there's going to be variation. Those that get through are going to be different from those that don't get through. But more than this, the differences on average are going to be the sorts of things which help people. In other words, those that get through are going to have slightly better eyesight, or be slightly more agile, or when we are hunter-gatherers, be slightly better at walking bipedally rather than on all fours. And so over the years, you're going to get this natural form of selection, and this is going to lead to evolution. So in other words, Darwin now has got his cause, which is the equivalent to the Newtonian cause or force of gravitational attraction. Darwin was quite explicit that that's what he got. I mean, I'm not putting this, as it were, something one's reading into him. This is something which is going on. So again, as you see, all the time, Darwin's working with the idea, oh yes, that there's going to be a struggle for existence. He gets this from Malthus. That I've got to find a cause. He gets this from Newton. And next, please. And particularly, what's going to happen is the features that get selected, and look at these little birds, look at their beaks. These are birds, they're from the Galapagos. They're known now as Darwin's finches. These little birds have very strong beaks because they're very good at eating nuts and that sort of thing. There are other birds with very fine beaks. They're insectivorous and that sort of thing. In other words, these birds are adapted. And once again, this was something, and I'm going to be talking about this in just a couple of moments, that the natural theologians were all saying at the time. Oh, yes, if you look at organisms, they seem as if they were designed. Those beaks look as if they were designed in order that the birds could eat big nuts and that sort of thing. And he got this from Archdeacon Paley, which he got as an undergraduate when he was studying theology. So once again, Darwin gets an element from his past, which, as I say, he takes in, turns it around like with a kaleidoscope, and lo and behold, we've got the Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, which, as I say, for various reasons, he sat on for 20 years, and finally he published it in 1859. Next, please. And this is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And so this is, in fact, Darwin's classic book. I should say, incidentally, that as soon as Darwin published, everybody knew about this. He was already very well known because in the 1840s, he'd written a wonderful travel book, The Voyage of the Beagle, all about being on HMS Beagle and all. And of course, this was the day when people loved, this was, believe it or not, there was no television. There was no internet. There were no, God almighty, there were no iPhones. But so what did people do? They read. And often what would happen is in the evening, usually the mother would read aloud to the whole family. That's what you did for an hour and a half after supper. Instead of watching telly, you'd have these readings. So people were looking for good things to listen to, like Charles Dickens' novels. And Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, which is a wonderful travel book, meant that Darwin was a well-known figure in England by the time he published this book. So everybody knew about it and picked up on it. 12 years later, Darwin then turned to Our Own Species, and next please, and he published a sort of sequel, The Descent of Man, which is obviously about the evolution of humans. A little bit different, but in fact, it's completely and utterly the theory of the origin. Darwin didn't change his mind about how evolution works. And so The Descent of Man is completely and utterly the theory that he'd got in The Origin. Now, I want to now, okay, so this is Darwin. I want now to sort of start swinging towards the religious side of things. Next, please. Okay. Oh, yes. One more thing. Let's just, well, the religious side of things. Let's just run through Darwin himself, because one of the things I want to make is Darwin's not Richard Dawkins. Darwin is not a violent atheist. In fact, as you can see from the top, Darwin starts out as an Anglican, I mean, Church of England. His mother's family were Unitarians. That means they believed in Jesus. They thought Jesus was a very good man, but they didn't think that Jesus was divine. They were Unitarians, which meant they denied the Trinity. So in other words, they thought there was just one God, and that Jesus was not, in fact, God. He was just a very good bloke. And in fact, Darwin's wife was a Unitarian, and they used to go to church on Sundays. And when Holy Communion came by, she would get up and turn her back, because she didn't believe, you see, she didn't believe that the bread and wine could turn into the body and blood of Christ, because that would mean that Christ was something special, and she brought up not to believe this. I should say the clergyman didn't mind this, and in fact, the clergyman was Darwin's best friend for a long time. Because they were upper class, they were upper middle class people. And so anyhow, Darwin was intended to become a clergyman, because this was, as I say, a good job for a well-connected, well-heeled young man. But then he went on the Beagle voyage. And on the Beagle voyage, he went on the Beagle voyage as a sincere Christian, believing in all the miracles, the marriage at Cana, for instance, water into wine, feeding of the 5,000, Jesus rising from the dead. While he was on the Beagle voyage, his thinking started to slip away from miracles. He started to think, I just don't think miracles occurred. He did not give up on God, but he started to think of God in terms of God as an unmoved mover. God set it all working in the beginning, and then sat back and watched it unfurl without having to say, boom, miracle, boom, miracle. In fact, Darwin thought, and there were many others who were in fact thinking along these lines, Darwin thought this was a better conception of God. So he was what we know as a deist, from the Latin word deo, rather than a theist, from the Greek word meaning God. So, as I say, Darwin was a believer all the way through, but for many years he was a deist rather than a theist. And that's what he was when he published The Origin of Species. So, in fact, and Darwin says this in The Origin, he says, this is not an atheistic book. This is a book, I think, which, as it were, proves God even better than we thought before, because I can show that God did it all through miracle rather than having to create in 6 days and that sort of thing. Now, towards the end of his life, Darwin became an agnostic. In other words, he stopped believing in a God. He was never an atheist. He was never, ever an atheist. But why was this? It wasn't because of the science. It was because of the theology. In fact, particularly his father and his older brother, Erasmus Darwin, were both what they called free thinkers. Both of them were pretty atheistic. And Darwin saw this. He wasn't with them, but he did think that his father, who was a doctor, and his brother, who was his older brother, he thought these were just two of the best men he'd ever met. And he said quite openly, he said, if Christianity says that these people are going to go to hell because they didn't believe, he says, if people like this, honest, decent people, are going to go to hell because their reasoning takes them this way, I don't want anything to do with Christianity. So that's why he became an agnostic. I should say Darwin was very common. People like the novelist George Eliot and Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's great supporter, they all became agnostics in the 1870s. So Darwin, I do want to stress that Darwin was in no sense out of the loop. He was very much what many English intellectuals were becoming. He was no longer a Christian. He never became an atheist. He always looked upon atheism as rather vulgar. And I'm quite sure if he'd read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, he would have been absolutely appalled. But he was, so as I say, he was an agnostic. And this is the way that he went. Now, as you can see, he ended up by being buried in Westminster Abbey. More on that in a moment. Okay, so this is Darwin. Now, why were people so convinced that God did exist? Next, please. And mainly the argument, and particularly in England, was the argument from design, or what is known as the teleological argument. Teleology means ends, thinking in terms of ends. And the teleological argument, the argument from design, says look around you, particularly look at organisms. They are remarkable. they are complex, but they also seem as if they were designed. Look at the eye. The eye is made on exactly the same principles as the telescope. Telescopes have telescope makers, telescope designers. Therefore, the eye must have an eye maker, an eye, as it were, designer. Who is this? It's obviously not a human. It is the great optician in the sky. In other words, this is the classic argument. It goes back to Plato's Phaedo, but it's the classic argument for the existence of God. God exists because the world is so complex and works so well, it functions. And notice, teleological. In other words, why do we have an eye? Not because the eye now, but because we will be able to see things in the future. As we grow up, we will be able to, I mean, a lot of things, for instance, you have and you can't use them. Think of your genitalia, for instance. When you're a kid, you don't use them. But why do you have them then? Because later, when you're in 20s and 30s, you can reproduce, which is what you're supposed to do. So in other words, you have them now in order for what they're going to do in the future. And so this, as I say, is the argument from design or the teleological argument. Now, what Darwin's going to do is what Darwin does is he undermines this. Next, please. Undermines this argument. So this is God. In other words, the argument says this is God. God did it. God done it. Okay, next, please. So what did Darwin do? Now, he does not want to deny that the eye seems as if designed. In fact, that's absolutely fundamental to Darwin. Yes, the eye seems as if designed. What do I mean by this? The eye seems to work like a telescope, but we have eyes, even, as it were, when we're born, before we looked at anything. But why do we have them? Because in the future, we will need them in order to get around. And as we all know, people with better sight are better off, better for struggle for existence, better for reproduction than people who are half blind. I mean, yeah, okay. Today, of course, we have all sorts of ways of helping, the nearsighted, and people wear glasses and that sort of thing. But basically, the argument is these are the characteristics we have in order for the future. But why do we have them? And what Darwin wanted to say is, no, we do not have to invoke a designer God. As I say, Darwin at this time thought there was a God, thought that God did it, but he didn't do it, as it were, by getting into, as it were, like an optician and getting everything on his bench and then looking at it, working at it and putting it all together and finally producing a telescope or finally, no, it all came about naturally. So how does it come naturally? Well, because you have variations, and those variations, on average, which help you to survive and reproduce, are going to be the ones that are carried on, just like the shaggier sheep and the more bacon a pig and that sort of thing. In other words, those are the ones that are going to survive and reproduce naturally. But of course, they're also teleological. They're, as it were, they seem as if designed for the future. In other words, why do we have eyes? In order to see. But of course, the thing is, it's not the future as such which is doing this. It's because it happened in the past that people who had eyes are people who are going to be able to see. And so today, when people are born with eyes, we say they're going to be able to see. Now, of course, the world might be covered in smoke, global warming. So nobody sees. So in fact, we've got eyes, but we never saw. But of course, that's the same with a designer. I'm God. I designed the eyes. The world is covered in smoke. And so you've got these eyes. I designed them, but they're never used. So Darwin's no worse off there. The point is, what Darwin is doing is through natural processes, and by natural, I mean law processes, showing how you get design-like effects in the world without having to invoke a good God, a designer God. I mean, as I say, Darwin, in fact, thought there was a God, but that's, as it were, by the by, because after Darwin became an agnostic and doubted there was a God, his argument was unchanged. He still said, why do we have eyes? Because natural selection brought them about. Richard Dawkins at one point said, Darwin didn't make it necessary to be an atheist, but he certainly made it possible because no longer did one say, as one said before Darwin, oh, well, however difficult it might be to believe in God, you have to, because the world is designed like. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher of the 18th century, the greatest English-speaking philosopher ever, tried this, and at the end he said, there's all sorts of problems with the argument from design. For instance, why don't the really good design things usually have a number of people designing? Are we to say that there's a number of gods? But at the end, David Hume said, yes, but it's designed like there has to be a designer or designers or something there. And what Darwin was saying is, no, there isn't. Well, what's the consequence? And I'm bringing the story now much more down to the future, down to the present. So how have people reacted to what Darwin did? Next, please. Well, I think we find that there are three positions that people take. As I say, Richard Dawkins at one point, I think, was easier, but now he's hardened. Darwin says, oh no, Darwin shows that you cannot have God and Darwin. Darwin's right, therefore God is wrong. Now, equally on the other side, the creationists, incidentally, as I'm sure you know, particularly in America, are the evangelicals who believe the Bible is literally true. 6 days of creation, humans are the last, Noah's flood covering the whole earth and everything like that. And what they say is, if this is true, then Darwin must be wrong. In other words, you cannot have, just like Dawkins, they say you cannot have God and evolution or Darwinian evolution at the same time. Dawkins says, too bad for God. Duane Gish says, too bad for Darwin. And then there's those in the middle, people like John Henry Newman, who was born an Anglican, but the great 19th century theologian who became a Catholic and ended up as Cardinal Newman. And what he said is, I don't think it works that way. And I'm going to show you. He said, I believe in God. And because I believe in God, I believe in design. I believe things are designed. But I don't look at things which are designed and say that this leads me to believe in God. In other words, what Newman is saying is, I don't think you prove God through the argument from design, through looking at the world and saying, yes, God necessarily exists. However, he said, I do believe that God does exist. But it, as it were, it's a different, goes the other way. So I'll just show you these three people as we go through. Next, please. So this is Richard Dawkins. I have to show you this. This. My wife is the person next to Richard Dawkins. This, I should say, was taken a long time ago, 1985. When I was still friends with Richard. I think I'm still friends with Richard Dawkins. But my wife and I went to visit him, and this is them sitting in the back garden. And so that's Richard Dawkins, who says, oh no, you can't have God and evolution at the same time. Evolution, Darwinian evolution is right, therefore God is wrong. Next, please. And then on the other hand, you've got Duane T. Gish, and this is Duane Gish on the right-hand side. I should say I was a very good friend of Gish. I was involved in court cases against him, but he was the kind of guy that you could argue with all day long and then go, well, he didn't have a drink because he was a teetotaler, but you could go and have a cup of coffee or whatever. And this is Duane Gish, and he wrote this book called Evolution, The Fossils Say No, and then he brought out a later edition, Evolution, The Fossils Still Say No. Now, notice that Gish, like a lot of people, is saying it's the fossil record which tells you about evolution. As I say, Darwin didn't think that way. Darwin, and I think most evolutionists today, if you ask them why they believe in evolution, what's the best evidence for evolution? I suspect 9 out of 10 of them would say it's geographical distribution. Why is it that the organisms, the birds in, let's say, on the oceanic islands off Africa look like African birds, but the birds on the oceanic islands off South America look like South American birds? It's not a miracle. It's because they went to the islands and they evolved when they got there. In other words, this is the best evidence that we've got for evolution. But as I say, Duane Gish says it's either evolution or God. It's God, therefore evolution is false. And finally, we've got Father Newman, who, as I say, said, no, I believe in God. I believe in God. Therefore, as I look at the world, I say, what a wonderful world that God has made. He says, I don't deny the design, but what I do is I believe in God, and then I look at the world and say, what a tremendous God this is. He says, I don't look at the world and say, I wonder why the world's like this. Oh, believe in God. No. I think this is interesting because it's pointing to, I think, an important point that Newman is basically saying we don't believe in God because of arguments. We believe in God because we have faith. Faith points us to God rather than the argument. So you see, you've got these two ways of getting to God. One is faith, and this is the sort of position that somebody like, well, certainly St. Paul would took. And it's certainly the position that somebody like Kierkegaard took in the 19th century, and in the 20th century, Karl Barth. Whereas you've got the argument from proof of God, from evidence, and certainly Plato, for instance, in the Phaedo, is quite clear when Socrates is about to take the hemlock. Everybody says to him, Socrates, why aren't you worried about dying? And he says, well, because I believe in God. And they say, well, why do you believe in God? He says, because I look around and the world just couldn't be chance. It must be a God. And this, as I say, is a popular argument. It was very popular with the British through the 16th, 17th, 18th century. So this is the argument which starts with reason. Okay, next, please. So, as I say, should you believe in God? The person of faith is going to say, yes, but it's not because of the evidence. It's because I feel God exists in my heart. Whereas the person of reason is going to say, yes, I believe in God. Oh, Darwin shows me that that doesn't work. Doesn't mean to say they don't believe in God, but obviously then if you're like Darwin and there's other arguments against God, you're going to say no. So I think you've got this sort of bifurcation, which between faith and reason. You certainly have. So these are the two positions. So next, please. So on the one hand, then you've got the person of faith. This is St. Paul being struck blind on the road to Damascus. And the quote I've got is, the quote basically says, if you don't believe in faith, good works don't matter. In fact, this is the Catholics from the Council of Trent, the sort of counter-Reformation of the 16th century, which says bluntly, faith over good works. In other words, God depends on faith. Forget all the arguments, forget everything else. Either you've got faith or you haven't. Now, as I say, for somebody like myself, how do I even kind of grasp this? Because I'm somebody who spent 6 years at Bootham and then said, I don't think God exists. It wasn't quite that, but it wasn't far off. Anyhow, so what does the person who doesn't have faith? Well, I think all of us sometimes have that feeling. Darwin had it, where you have that feeling, yeah, I don't believe, oh my God, this couldn't be just chance. There must be something more. For me, it's opera. For me, particularly, it's Mozart. Next, please. For me, when I listen to the music of Mozart, I find myself saying, this just can't be chance. This must mean something else. And particularly, it's opera, and it's particularly the Magic Flute. Next, please. And what I'm showing you is the high priest Sarastro, who sings in these within these holy walls. Everybody loves each other. We forgive everybody. And I have to say that when I listen to Sarastro singing, even I, non-believer as I am, I'm not an atheist, I'm an agnostic, even I, non-believer as I am, every now and then say, this couldn't just be chance. This has to point to something which is more. And the reason why, incidentally, why I'm showing you this particular picture is that this does, in fact, go back to my time at Bootham. In 1956, the school put on a performance of the Magic Flute. It was directed by the music teacher, Percy Lovell. And this was the Magic Flute. It did two things for me. One was when I heard Sarastro singing this within these holy walls, I was just blown away. I just simply said, oh my goodness, I've never encountered beauty. I feel the same way often, for instance, when I look at a Vermeer novel, a Vermeer painting, for instance, that, this couldn't just be chance. It has to mean something. And for me, I want to say that experience at Bootham, and thank you, Percy Lovell, who I hardly knew, but who was the most important teacher for me the whole time. Thank you, Percy Lovell, because it's meant that I love opera and I still love opera. And I went to see, Rigoletto last week, and I still love opera. So, as I say, thank you, Bootham, thank you, Percy Lovell. But the reason why I'm showing you is because for me, every now and then, this gives me a notion of the transcendent. It doesn't last, but I've got it. The other position, though, of course, is working through faith, through reason. And of course, the trouble with reason is it runs into problems almost immediately. Next, please. And particularly the problem of pain. And David Hume was good on this. If God's all loving and God's all powerful, then why on earth do we have pain? Why does pain exist? An all loving, all powerful God would not allow pain to exist. Well, it's one of these things that we philosophers make a living out of. And it works back and forth. I'm not sure it's a full explanation, but there is an explanation. Next, please. The Darwin theory says there's going to be a struggle for existence. You're not going to have evolution without that. You're not going to have natural selection without that. That's the only way you're going to get a working world is through pain. And God, we've always said, God cannot do the impossible. Descartes thought he could. But most of us say God could not make 2 + 2 = 5, and God could not make a world that's adapted that works if, in fact, we didn't have the struggle, we didn't have pain. Incidentally, I wanted to show you a different picture. I wanted to show you a picture of naked mud wrestling. But the authorities at Bootham, when I proposed this in my talk, said, oh no, you can't possibly do this. The girls would like it, but the boys would be so shocked that they'd never get over this. So I'm having to show you wolves fighting rather than humans fighting. Anyhow, but the point is, the struggle for existence shows that you have to have pain. That's God can't make 2 + 2 = 5. God can't make a functioning world. So it's not, as it were, it's not God's fault. It's not his fault. I think a much more interesting argument, I'm going to finish on this one, next please, is the whole question of progress. Does evolution lead to progress? Because if Christianity is true, humans can't be just chance. It's not just God created the world and, oh gosh, I made humans, and so let's do the whole Jesus thing. No, of course, you read the Bible, and even if you don't take it literally, you take it allegorically as true, and it's clear that humans are special. But does evolution mean that the world is progressive? Does it mean that we're going to lead up to humans? And what I'm showing you is progress. There's some debate about what I'm showing you. Philosophers, of course, think that on the right, the final thing is a philosopher, the highest possible form of life that you possibly can, the brightest people on campus. Big debate about what you have at the other end. University professors usually say, those are university administrators. But today, I'm inclined to think it's anti-vaxxers. I think anti-vaxxers are right at the left. So that's my idea of progress, from anti-vaxxers to philosophers. So there we go. But the question is evolution progressive? Darwinism, it's what wins. It doesn't necessarily mean that the winner is going to be particularly nice. The winner's going to be the winner. It's not going to be particularly nice. So how could you possibly guarantee that humans are actually going to exist? Well, one way, next please, is to pretend. Dawkins says, oh yes, the world is progressive. Stephen Jay Gould said, no, the world is not progressive. So evolutionists divide on this. There's no ready answer. But next, please. Well, my solution is what you might call multiverses, and I'm showing you those on the left. I mean, if they're multiverses, an infinite number, then obviously evolution's going to occur sometimes on other planets. And if you've got enough of them, then at some point you're going to get humans. I mean, if we could evolve, we will evolve. That's what having an infinite number is. The drawback is you're going to have a lot of failures. And what I'm showing you on the right is a turnip. And I'm worried that there's going to be planet after planet with beings with the IQs, intelligence of turnips, and the sporting ability of Michael Ruse, which is not to be advertised. So, as I say, this is a solution, but I'm not sure it's a solution that the Christian wants or that God wants. So the interesting thing, there's a lot of these things where I'm not giving you an answer because there's different sides to it. And that's what makes the whole debate so interesting. So I'm not coming out at the end and telling you what to believe or not to believe. What I'm coming out at the end is, I hope when you've heard me, you'll say, gosh, that's really interesting. I wonder if I could go out and buy one of Ruse's books. That's what I need. I'll get on Amazon.com and buy one of Ruse's books and make me rich. Final slide, please. And so this is Charles Darwin. Interesting. Westminster Abbey, which of course all you Brits know is the apotheosis of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. That's where the Queen, the monarchs are crowned. And at Westminster Abbey, on the one side you find Isaac Newton's tomb, on the other side you find Charles Darwin's tomb. So in other words, Darwin didn't die, as it were, reviled as a non-believer, as somebody that we're embarrassed about. I mean, I don't think, for all his merits, I don't think Richard Dawkins is going to be buried in Westminster Abbey, but Charles Darwin was, and I don't think anybody thought that that was inappropriate. Fine, thank you. Next, final slide, please. It's supposed to do, really, what it's supposed to do at the bottom is say, that's all, folks. That's all, folks. And basically, I'm showing you Bugs Bunny and all the others, funny tunes. That's all, folks. I finished.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Michael, with your typical Michael humour there. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. People are very welcome to ask questions of Michael using the chat function. And I do have a few questions. First of all, I have a question from an 8-year-old. So this is a super question, who would like to know, what would be the teleological explanation for tailbones and vestigial parts of an organism?
Oh, this is an 8-year-old who's altogether too clever. I mean, this is an 8-year-old in the good old days would have passed the 11 plus and gone to a grammar school. No, that's a very good question. The nice thing is, I don't think Darwinism expects everything to work. The basic thing, it's a question, not that we're perfect, but that we're better than the person next to you. It's like running away from a bear in the forest. It's not being absolutely fast that matters. It's being faster than the chap next to you that matters, if the bear's coming after you. So Darwinism doesn't mean that everything is going to work. And so obviously, say something like vestigial organisms or characteristics might be things that were useful in the past, but now, they're not useful. And so they decline. But in a way, it would be almost too much effort to get rid of them. Just go along with them. They're not causing us any bother. We've got them. I mean, like let's say male nipples or something like that. And so, why go to all the effort of redesigning humans so that males are born without nipples, so that we're all born without appendices, and so on and so forth? Why not just leave it be? And so these are things I think get left over. And of course, the other big thing is what biologists call homologies, the similarities, the isomorphisms between the bones of different species. Why is it that the forelimb, the arm of the human, the forelimb of the horse, which is used for running, the wing of the bat, which is used for flying, the flipper of the dolphin, which is used for swimming, why do they all have the same bones in the same order, obviously moved around in different ways? Well, because they're common ancestors. There's no adaptive reason for this. So in other words, what I'm saying is Darwinism doesn't imply that everything's going to be adaptive. The question is, are we adaptive enough to beat the person next to us?
Wonderful. We have a question from an old scholar here, Peter, in America. It's lovely to get your question, Peter. How does good and evil fit into the big picture?
Well, it's all a question, isn't it? I mean, I think if you're a person of faith, then obviously you're going to go into it with the belief that we are good, or that God's good. Now, obviously, evil is going to be there. If you're an Augustinian, you think that it's because of the fall and original sin and everything like that. But don't forget, a lot of Christians, including, I might add, Quakers, do not buy into that Augustinian, position about they call it substitutionary atonement. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross washes away our sins. Quakers are like people in the Eastern Orthodox, that they believe that Jesus is a wonderful example, that Jesus is an example of how we should behave. And so, as I say, I don't find it a big problem. Now, if you ask me at a more specific level, then don't forget that humans for 5 million years were hunter-gatherers. We lived in small bands of about 50, going around the plains with the guys wearing jock straps and the women, like something out of National Geographic. Well, how did we get on? We're not that strong. We're not that fast. We got on because we're good cooperators. We work together very well. In other words, morality is not something which, oh my goodness, we have morality. Why do we have it? No, morality is an adaptation just as much as eyes or tongues or anything like that. And particularly in the case of humans, morality is something which makes us cooperate, which makes us good survivors and reproducers. And it's as simple as that. So I don't find the good and evil to be a big worry, at least at the biological level. As I say, at the theological level, well, you've got to bring something into it. And in a way, as I say, that's not my position, but that's not my worry. Let's put it that way. So I think I can deal with morality at the biological level. At the theological level, I'll leave it to people. I'll leave it to the headmaster. That's what headmasters are for. Okay, next, please.
Super. I will ask him that question tomorrow. Okay. Oh, this is a nice question. You'll enjoy this one. So if, hypothetically, you could ask Charles Darwin one question, what would you ask him?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, the trouble is I'm not allowed to be rude, am I, on the program?
No, you're not.
So I'm not allowed to ask him what he and Fitzroy did on the spare evenings when they were in South America.
No.
Okay, I won't ask that question. I don't know. What would I ask him? What would I ask him? That's a good question. I think I would ask him, I guess because I'm a philosopher, I guess I would ask him, you're an agnostic, Darwin, but what do you think there's any meaning to it at all? Do you think all of this evolution is just sort of happening? Or do you think even if it's not a Christian answer or something, there might be some kind of force, good or evil, which is behind it all? I think Darwin, if you look at his correspondence, particularly in later years, he's really quite sophisticated thinking about these things because he had a theological come philosophical training as a young man. So I think, because I'm a philosopher, those are the questions I'd ask him. If I were a scientist, I'd be much more likely to ask him some sort of scientific question. I mean, he worked on climbing plants later in life and that sort of thing. If I were a scientist, I'd probably ask him about that. But for me, as a philosopher, I guess I'd be asking him more about the overall meaning of it. But I have to say, as a pupil from Bootham School in the 1950s, that wouldn't be the question I'd ask him.
Okay, well, I have a question from a pupil from Bootham School in the 2022. What do you think the explanation is for the apparent increased rate of evolution in humans despite the lack of survival of the fittest?
Well, you say the increased. I don't know. I mean, first of all, what do you mean by lack of the survival of the fittest? I mean, it's still going on. I mean, look, I live in North America. I live in America. In the last 2 years, 1 million people have died from COVID. 1 million people have died from COVID. Anybody who says to me that the struggle for existence is not going on is just not reading the New York Times. I mean, of course it's going on. We may not see it straight off. And I'm quite convinced, of course it is. I mean, people who couldn't give up smoking because they didn't have the willpower, they all died. I mean, people who overeat because they don't have the willpower to say, no, I don't need another donut. By and large, they don't do as well as people, the scraggy Aggies who say, oh no, I'd rather go out running or something like that. So I'm not convinced that the struggle for existence is over, or at least struggle for reproduction. The other question is the speed of evolution. Well, we took 5 million years to evolve from, 5-6 million years to evolve from apes, our closest relatives are the chimpanzees, to the kind of beings that we are now. That's not fast evil. There's a lot of generations in 5 million years. So I'm not quite sure that I'd want to say that evolution in humans is necessarily that fast, or that today it's happening. I mean, I think it's going on, but I'm not convinced that it's necessarily going on faster than, let's say, evolution amongst Darwin's finches or something like that.
Okay, we have a question here from Nigel Hughes. This is really exciting because Nigel is actually going to be doing our next Bootham talk.
Oh, yes, I saw that. Hello, Nigel. I see you UC Riverside. I visited there. Pretty good university.
Well, we'll give
I think we've got a better football team than you have. Okay.
Okay, so Nigel's question is, do you think that those who advocate Dawkins and his colleagues' positions have overall hindered acceptance of evolution among the general public in North America?
I'm not sure I think that. I think what they've done is made a lot of people younger than you and I are, Nigel, I saw when you were at Bootham. I think if I were, look, frankly, if I were at Bootham today, or, you know, I would find the whole debate about evolution. I mean, I would find Dawkins tremendously exciting. I love reading I love reading the God Delusion until he calls me the Neville Chamberlain of the evolutionary debate. I'm not sure about that. But no, I think that Dawkins and others like that have made the whole thing alive. I mean, the fact that I disagree with somebody doesn't mean to say that I want to shut them up or that I don't welcome what they're doing or saying. I mean, we're not talking about Hitler now. We're talking about, you know, somebody like Dawkins, who Dawkins is, if you read the God Delusion, Dawkins is more moralistic than the Pope. Because Dawkins is saying, you should not do this, you should not do that, because it perverts the growing up of children. And though, now you may disagree with him about that, but there's a sincerity there. So if I were a young person, I would, from the 50s, frankly, evolution I don't think was a huge topic. We get it sometimes on the television on Sunday afternoons, the Brains Trust, Julian Huxley and JBS Haldane would talk about, but it wasn't the big thing. And certainly at Bootham, I was never, ever taught evolution in any of the classes. I mean, that's just a fact. And so I think today that it's a lot more exciting. And if I were a teenager or whatever, I've had teenagers and I know that I'd want to read these. So no, I don't agree with Dawkins, but I certainly welcome Dawkins. Of course, I write against him, so you know it keeps me in business. I mean, if there weren't people like Dawkins, I'd have to invent them.
Okay, this is a question that I think follows on for that, and poor Luke, who's typing the questions in for us, doesn't actually have this one. I'm sorry, Luke. Would being a perfect Dawkins atheist make the average person happier?
What if we were all like Dawkins?
Mm-hmm. The average person, would you think they'd be happier?
Oh, I don't know. Not if I got a wife, it wouldn't make me happier. That's for damn sure. No, I don't see why. No, I don't think everybody believing the same thing makes us happier. I think that just makes us into robots. I mean, let's face up to it. That's exactly what fascism wants to do. It wants to make us all think the same way. I think again, you're talking to a philosopher. So in a way, you know what my answer is going to be. My answer is going to be that it's so much more fun, the search for knowledge, than finding it. That's what makes life really interesting. It's having to go out there and work at it and work for it. I mean, if we all had the answers when we were teenagers, what would we do? We'd sit on our intellectual bottoms for the rest of our lives. How boring, how absolutely boring. But no, we've got the debate. I mean, I'd like to think that this is why you folks are listening to me, why I'm talking to you. I'd love it that when we finished, you look at each other and say, oh my God, I'm going to write a letter of complaint to Bootham School because I don't want another lecture like that. That made me so mad, blah, blah, blah. I've done what I wanted to do.
Okay. We have one more question, and Dawkins clearly is the person who's getting the question. So Richard Dawkins criticizes the argument from personal incredulity as it is a weak argument. Do you think he uses this same argument to say there is no God?
Yeah, I probably think so. Yes. I mean, personally, I mean, where do you start though? Where do you end? If you don't say, I just, that's total BS. I just couldn't. No, it's absolute nonsense to say that the right way to fight the COVID pandemic is to have no mandates about wearing masks or anything like that. I mean, the governor of Florida is saying exactly that. Personally, I just lean back and say, yeah, I don't know how to argue against that. I mean, it's just so completely nuts. I mean, I use stronger language than that, but I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So I think we all have to do that. On the other hand, it's not good enough to stop there. What you've then got to do is move on. And I think that my governor is absolute nonsense personally, but I've then got to, as it were, go out and look at what epidemiologists and others tell me about this, and whether or not the statistics show that wearing masks helps, and those sorts of things. I mean, in other words, because you find it incredible or incredulous, it doesn't mean to say that you stop. That almost in a way is where you start. And as I've said, for me, it's the search for the truth rather than the truth that has made my life so incredibly exciting. I mean, I have to end on this point. I don't know how much I want to thank Bootham. I guess I want to thank everybody. But I have had such a full and happy, fulfilled life, being a philosopher, teaching young people about it, these sorts of things. And I've still, as soon as I put this down, I'm going to dash off to my other computer and start writing all over again. I've just had a new idea. This is really good. I think this one's really going to work. I mean, that's what makes life exciting. That's what, even when you're 81 and other things don't appeal quite as much as they used to, being an intellectual, being a philosopher, being a teacher, being alive, all of these things, that's what makes it worthwhile.
That's brilliant, Michael. I think that is an excellent point to finish. Thank you so much for educating and entertaining us and actually getting us thinking. It's been really thought-provoking. So thank you very much. And we have already slightly trailed Nigel Hughes is going to be our speaker next week. So he's speaking on Tuesday, the 8th of February. And he's talking about the ups and downs in Himalaya using fossils to explore the evolution of the world's greatest mountain chain. And that's going to be an excellent talk as well. I hope everyone will be able to join us for that. And so thank you everyone for joining us. It's been great to actually get the Bootham Talks back on and up and running again. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Okay, good night everyone.